Welcome to the first of our Indonesian Social Science Seminar Series, or IS4, sponsored by the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, the Cornell Southeast Asia Program, and KITLV. This series brings together social science experts from around the globe to discuss pressing issues facing Indonesia and foster new opportunities for networking between those of you in Indonesia and those of us in other parts of the world. I'm Michelle Ford, the Director of the Sydney Southeast Asia and your host for this first seminar. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and would like to begin by acknowledging their continued custodianship of this land. Today, we're going to hear from Professor Vedi Hadiz from the University of Melbourne and Dr. Inaya Rahmani from UI about the political language of Islamic populism in Indonesia. Vedi and Inaya will speak for around 20 minutes. We will then hear from our discussant, Professor Nancy Smith-Hefner from Boston University. After hearing Nancy's comments, we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. Please post your questions via the Q&A function, and I'll pose a series of them to our speakers in that time. So warm welcome to everybody. Thanks for getting up early for those of you in Indonesia, and hopefully this is the beginning of a long engagement about Indonesia from around the world. Over to you, Vedi and Inaya.
Hi, I'll start off first. Thank you, Michelle, for inviting us. So just as a quick background, I have been working on the issue of Islamic populism from a political economy perspective, and Inaya has been working on issues of Islam and society from basically you might call it cultural politics or cultural sociology perspective. And we've been sort of interacting a lot, citing each other and finding a lot of intersections in our work. And then we decided, let's try to articulate those intersections a bit more explicitly and in a way that's more coherent and perhaps provide more insights into the issue of Islamic populism than I would have otherwise in my own writings conveyed, or Inaya perhaps in her own writing. So together we thought that maybe we could come up with something new, and this is a kind of an attempt at doing that. So we start out with the premise, which I think is fairly accepted in the literature on populism, though not accepted by everybody, that populism is basically a reaction to, contemporary populism is a reaction to the social dislocations, new social marginalizations, social transformations that are associated with neoliberal globalization and its various contradictions. And that these reactions are always, fragmented and incoherent, and they manifest differently across different parts of the world. And so we're trying to look at this reaction as manifest in what I've called Islamic populism. And Islamic populism, in our work here, we're looking at it as a way of bringing together diverse sets of social interests that would otherwise not have necessarily a lot in common, but through the instrument of the lexicon of a political language that is derived from religious references and symbolisms, in this case related to Islam. And so we look at Islamic populism, or the language of Islamic populism in Indonesia, but also in comparative perspective to sort of understand how religiously derived lexicons or populisms actually have some kinds of common themes, right? So we find that the language of Islamic populism, like the language of Hindutva or various other forms of religiously derived populisms, can bring together different sets of social interests that otherwise would not be as homogeneous as defined under the rubric of populism, right? So in Islamic populism in particular, the important thing is the concept of the ummah. Now, the umat is supposed to be transnational, right? But because the politics of Islam is always contested, almost always contested within national boundaries, in the confines of national polities, then it takes on a kind of national specificity, right? And so we understand the umat in Indonesia, or the concept of the umat in Indonesia, as a stand-in really for the concept of the people that is more associated with conventional populism. So as you know, the people is defined as these poor, virtuous, perennially marginalized sections of society that are, subject to the whims and the oppression of elites or foreign powers, etc. So Islamic populism brings together these people who, in their imagination, are perennially marginalized and dispossessed from colonialism up to the present period. Now, but what we suggest is that Islamic populism doesn't actually, and the language of Islamic populism doesn't actually pose a fundamental threat to the status quo, because that language is being mainstreamed in political contestations over resources and power, the main actors of which are sections of the oligarchy. So basically, the language of Islamic populism has been absorbed into intra-oligarchic conflicts. And we do this, we try to explain this by combining political economy with cultural politics in a way that I suppose is inspired by Bob Jessup's work on cultural political economy, where culture really is embedded deeply into the structures and operations of political economy. And now I'll hand it to Inaya to substantiate everything I just said.
Thank you, Betty. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. And it's very early here in Indonesia. Anyway, continuing on Fedi's idea, the political language that we propose to define is the structures of ideas, norms, values that, as Fedi said, is embedded in the structures of political economy. So the institutions that support neoliberalism, which can encompass private health sector, privatized education services, retail industry, popular culture, and all of the processes of commodifications of social functions and symbols are part of the way these political languages are constructed. So it comes from the margins as well as in the mainstream of Indonesian society and any other sections in the world. And these, we posit, can be mobilized into forms of allegiances or exacerbate aggravations in the struggle over power in intra-oligarchic competition. And this language can be empirically seen in three aspects, which is part of my own writing. And in my writing, I also engage with Fedi's Islamic populism. It can be seen in the halal consumerism of the Ummah, popular culture, Islamic culture, and as well as the Muslim cyber army during heated political competition during the elections. And we use these three cases to flesh out structures of knowing, as well as feeling, as well as aspiring to something, and its impact in the shaping of Islamic populism. The dynamics, the reforming, the reaffirmation, which is a very fluctuative process, but fundamentally does not pose a threat. Firstly, halal consumerism, or the way Muslims consider to decide to purchase imported or national retail products, are endorsed by Muslim clerics. There is the halal label from MUI, the Indonesian Ulama Council. There's also fatwas issued out by different mazhabs from different leaders of Islamic organizations. And these, during the purchasing of pious halal products, it gives the larger Muslim lower, middle, and upper class tools to navigate the increasingly neoliberalized Indonesian society. Secondly, Muslim or Islamic popular culture encompasses Islamic films and melodrama like sinetron religi or music through nasyid, popular books, which could include chiclets, Islamic chiclets. It shapes the social imagination of the notional ummah about what it means to be a good Muslim. The conflicts that each character has within their daily setting reaffirms certain verses in the Quran that is useful to respond to increasingly competitive job markets, the difficulties to maintain a nuclear family, to find a husband or a wife, etc. So it operates on a daily level and it's structured within the economy. Thirdly, which is a more recent development, the 170 million of Indonesians have access to the internet, and at least 87% of the total internet users in Indonesia are Muslim. On a daily basis, they express their aggravations and aspirations on social media, whether they want to boycott a certain product, and it's very similar, the kind of products that they boycott or the kind of expressions that certain racial groups are taking away their jobs are similar to the moral themes that appear in statistics regarding halal consumerism and television ratings for Islamic melodrama. So algorithms, statistics on consumerism, and ratings for television and other popular culture products resonate with each other, while they have different methods of quantifying the kind of practices and behavior the Muslim middle class, which also is heterogeneous. All three cases, we argue, form political language and help political actors, to mobilize the meaning embedded among different sections of the Ummah. And this is supported, reproduced by the service industry that is very much intertwined with larger neoliberal structures. Here, we think that the notional Ummah, constructed through pious images, affirmed through Islamic clerics, and are practiced through halal consumerism and everyday purchasing, which can come from formal industries, large industries like multinational companies, or it can come from the kind of multi-level marketing in which usually female Muslim homemakers sell Islamic or halal medicine, such as the dates preferred by the Prophet, or honey, as part of a social group or social community, such as those of the Quranic recitation that come into private domestic settings. And these kind of political languages, what we think as halal or haram, what the Muslims think as good Islamic leaders, or those who are supported by Islamic clerics, like in the case of Prabowo receiving the support of Muslim clerics during elections, are examples of how these political language can be mobilized for intra-oligarchic competition. And these are activated to aid elite consolidation, and especially during the elections. We can see this specifically in the Muslim cyber army that mobilized symbols saying that Prabowo and Sandiaga Uno needs to be supported so that Jokowi, the kafir leader, or the communist leader who is pro-Chinese investment, needs to be prevented from leading the country. And if you choose Prabowo, then you are conducting Islamic rituals. While this condition is not specifically Indonesian, as countries and communities around the world have become also deeply ingrained in neoliberal capitalism, as Fedi has mentioned, we can see this in Hindutva nationalism, in which the symbol of Islamic ritual, which is the sacrifice of the cow, is mobilized among the Hindu to persecute Muslims during this festivity, in support of the BJP's win during the elections, and supporting policies to nationalize and prevent Muslim workers from not dominating because they're a minority, from participating in the food industry. The way the political language of Islamic populists manifest, however, are very dependent on these historical processes. So some countries, such as in Modi's India, these symbols of populism can is mobilized to the benefit of the BJP party, because the Muslim minority is seen to be privileged under the Congress party's more Western liberal orientation in the past. And we can see this as well in the campaign industry, in which the Muslim cyber army is part of, in which political campaigners ally with different sections of the elite, as well as certain political elites who are part of the media industry constructing Islamic popular culture. So we can see these the ways political language is embedded and reconstructed, constructed, mobilized through different economic structures, which owes very much to a process of neoliberalization. Fedi, back to you.
So what we've tried to do is to link up the sort of macro, sort of political economy structures, and to link it up with processes in the sphere of culture, where we see there are mutually reinforcing tendencies between the two, which then actually produces a result whereby Islamic populism is not, as I said earlier, a major fundamental threat to the status quo, because, as described by Inaya, a lot of it has been adopted, co-opted, and mainstreamed, right, by existing forces. So, what we do also try to show in our project, which is right now confined to a small book chapter, is that it's the mechanisms through which the language of Islamic populism are forged. In this case, I suppose we're partly inspired by the old works of Benedict Anderson about the languages of Islamic politics, and not just how they are forged, but also how and why they come to resonate with certain sections of the population. Now, and this has to do with issues of consumption habits, consumerism and so on, that have to do with the broader developments of the economy, developments in actually the commercialization of popular culture, and all of this, sort of are shaped and help to shape contestations over power and resources, and how these contestations are presented and articulated. And I suppose the last thing we try to do really is to try to link up, the material with the ideational, and that's always difficult, I suppose. But we do this for the specific purpose, and that is to look at how there are necessarily always contradictions within the broad social alliances that are brought together through the language or the political lexicon of Islamic politics, and how really, because they arise from mutually contradictory sort of sources and imperatives themselves, they also depict the kind of tenuous nature, of social alliances that can be broadly understood as struggling, or using the language of Islamic politics as an instrument in the broader contest over power and resources in Indonesia, which we still see to be, primarily driven by oligarchic interests. So I think we're exactly on 20 minutes there, Michelle.
Thanks very much, Fedi. So we'll hand over now to Nancy, who'll have some comments, I'm sure, on your presentation.
Yes, so first of all, I want to thank Fedi and Inaya for a fascinating talk. And actually, I had the benefit of looking at a draft of the longer paper. I followed their work for many years, and it's just wonderful to find myself here on a panel with them. And I also want to thank Michelle Ford, whose work I've also followed and drawn on many times in my own writing. one of the more unexpected and delightful benefits actually of the pandemic is that we've discovered these new opportunities to connect and share insights across continents. And I really hope they continue after the pandemic is over. So there's so many interesting aspects to Vedi and Anaya's presentation, but here I want to pick up on just one or two in particular. And first I want to repeat, underscore, as Vedi and Anaya note, that what we're looking at in Indonesia is a particular type of populism, one that Vedi has aptly referred to as Islamic populism, and that within Islamic populism, the Ummah, or the community of believers, takes the place of the people and stands in opposition to the corrupt and morally suspect elites against whom they're pitted. Against that background, then I want to expand on what Vedi and Inayas have observed, that in Indonesia, Islamic populism has been largely espoused by pious elements or groupings among the educated middle class. And I should preface my comments by noting that I'm not a political scientist. My background and training are in linguistics, and my own interests are more focused on the level of the interpersonal, on young people in particular, and on the specific forms of social practice and language that they employ, but also on the language, symbols, and lexicon that populist Muslim preachers use to make their appeals to young people. As some of you may know, I've conducted a number of years of research on young, educated middle class or aspiring middle class Muslim youth in Java, focusing in particular on gender and religious identifications. And so my comments are necessarily, I guess, a reflection of that work. So I want to focus just briefly on the political language of Islamic populism and its attractions for educated youth. In particular, how the languages of Islamic populist politics are constructed and activated by media markets, and especially by popular Muslim preachers who aim their message directly at young people. I want to use, or I will use the example of the popular Muslim preachers Felix Siao and also Salim Afila to illustrate my points. I know that Inaya has actually written extensively on Siao, and I draw on her work as well as the work of the Malay scholar Hu Huai Wang in my remarks. So the first thing I want to say is that from a language or discursive perspective, certainly one of the most interesting aspects of populist political styles used by popular media savvy Muslim preachers is the juxtaposition of a relaxed speech style and personal style with a rigidly conservative message. In Indonesian, this casual style is often referred to as gaul, and in its linguistic form, it includes elements of typically regional Javanese, Indonesian, as well as English. In the case of Siao, Wang writes, his preaching style is casual and friendly, yet again, the content is rigid and dogmatic. In the same way, Siao's books are colorful, they're even cutesy, they're illustrated in anime style cartoon characters. They often have these sort of bubblegum pink or baby blue covers, but their message is conservative, even radical. In terms of personal appearance, we see a similar pattern. Although Fila wears baju koko and a peci like other Muslim preachers, Siao more often shows up in batik shirt or maybe just a t-shirt and long pants. He occasionally wears a baseball cap, and he appears normal and approachable and down to earth. Though Fila wears somewhat more conventional Muslim clothing, nonetheless, he, like Siao, affects a similar stance of being one of the people, positioning himself outside of the realm of entrenched Muslim clerics and scholars. He writes, in fact, in his book, Nikmatnya Pacaran Setelah Pernikahan, the pleasure of courtship after marriage, I'm not an expert. I offer some observations so we can get through this period of life successfully. And he's talking about adolescence. And he actually says, as an adolescent myself, he uses the term remaja. And he goes on to talk, but it's interesting that in fact, at the time he's writing, he's actually 25. He's not really a remaja. Anyway, both Fila and Siao, in other words, meet their audience where they're at, adapting this sort of big brother tone of, I've gone through exactly what you have. I share your experience. I know what you're going through. Xiao achieves this in addition by drawing on his own conversion story. And I'm sure most of you know he's Chinese Indonesian who converted from Catholicism to Islam at university. And these preachers often also talk about how they met their wives and their own courtship experiences in their lectures and sermons. Along the same lines or similar lines, one of Xiao's employees reportedly said to Wang, "We speak the language of ordinary Muslims and show them we're part of them, not above them." This idea then of shared experience and of treating one's audience as being on the same level is also expressed in a well-known comment made by Xiao, which underscores at the same time his extensive media presence, and that is, everyone can conduct da'wah, everyone can preach, missionize, propagate the faith. It's as easy as giving a thumbs up on Facebook. These comments underscore what Vedi and Inaya have referred to as the changing nature of the tools that forge political language. That is, the important roles of varieties of mass media used by these popular preachers, that is Twitter and Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, and others. As Vedi and Inaya argue, this citing Gramsci, it is these new ways of using mass media that have in turn reinforced the potency of popular conviction. Such comments remind us again of Vedi and Inaya's definition of Muslim populism as one in which the Ummah, or the community of believers, takes the place of the people and stands in opposition to corrupt and morally suspect elites and non-Muslim kafir, against whom they're often pitted. The lines drawn by Xiao and Fila are in fact stark ones between those that they label as pious or devout, shaleha, and those who are under the influence of Satan. So I want to conclude just briefly with two observations. One is to underscore again how popular Muslim preachers use this relaxed, casual style of speech and presentation to convey an often dogmatic and conservative message. I'll give you the example of Fila, who argues against Valentine's Day, depicting it as a pagan practice that he says is pushed by stupid Christian youth that has now become a tool of capitalism to market products to clueless young people, saying, "Don't let a small thing like chocolate make you relatives with Satan." Valentine's Day, furthermore, he says, reinforces dating practices, in Fila's view, perceived by both youth and many of their parents as hip and modern. But here too, Fila warns, citing a hadith, "And I thought I was following the Rasul, but now I am doomed. I didn't realize Satan had become my lover." Elaborating further, Fila makes clear that all unchaperoned meetings with members of the opposite sex lead to the possibility of zina or adultery and must be avoided. All sex outside of marriage is sinful. And engaging in Western or non-Muslim celebrations like Valentine's Day is similarly haram. The second observation is related to the first, and that is that one of the ways populist messages take off and insinuate themselves within the broader social discourse is through a process of normalization that's facilitated by their innocuous form, both their innocuous linguistic form, but also the forms of their transmission. That is, by embedding these radical or conservative, maybe conservative is a better word, messages within the framework or style of casual coolness via hip language and the latest youth media. These approaches have contributed to the normalization, or I think what Vedi called the mainstreaming, or was that Inaya, of certain conservative Muslim ideas, and allowed them to circulate even more widely. Indexically, then, these conservative ideas regarding youth sociability and the proper form for intimate relations have become widely recognized as distinctive markers of membership within the Muslim Ummah. And I think I'll just stop here, but I think that's true even though, in fact, not all Muslim youth embrace them completely. They're very cognizant of these ideas.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Nancy. Just a reminder, if you've got questions, you can post them in the Q&A function. Bahasa Indonesia boleh juga, tidak usah bahasa Inggris kalau tidak mau. And we'll start with a few. I'll curate the order so that they kind of make more sense for our respondents. But Vedi and Inaya, if we can start with a question from Ananta, who asks, How do political clashes between conservative and modernist Islam during Indonesia's 2019 general election, alongside with Islamic popular cultural products such as Sabian and Nusa, shape the identity of Indonesian Muslims?
Inaya, do you want to have first go at that? Do you want to have first go at that, Inaya, or shall I?
I can give it a go.
Okay.
This is exactly the point that we were trying to make. The Ummah is, it comprises of different sections of the lower, middle, and upper class Muslims. And because they're very different, meaning that they have different, they're part of different class structures, and they have different daily habits, and in a daily setting, they don't interact with each other because the type of, the processes of neoliberalization pushes people into their private spaces. At the same time, though, when there is a yearning of an ummah, the yearning of collectivity that comes with the kind of isolation, individualization, and very high mobility that every worker is subject to under increasingly competitive and precarious labor market, the kind of yearning of being part of something is felt among these different sections of the Muslim classes. And the case of contestation between conservative and moderate Muslims pander to the competition between presidential candidates, because this also relates to the first question by the anonymous asker. Because the Muslim voters comprise of such a large section of the swing voters, each elite needs to appeal to as many Muslims as possible, at the same time as many voters as possible. So they have to work within that space in which they don't alienate the voters that they want to appeal to, but at the same time, they need to be able to mobilize the hard halal haram narrative to support positions. And when Jokowi took in Ma'ruf Amin, which means that he's trying to appeal to the traditionalists and voters that are loyal, at the same time, there is a large expanding middle class, traditionally or genealogically from their family, they're in NU, but as they move up in the social structure with education, with employment, with mobility in the class structure, they become accustomed to different sets of ideal relative to the segmentation, market segmentation they're part of. And this is the kind of sentiments or political language that the elites can play with. And here, campaigners are really crucial. The role of campaigners are really crucial because they monitor and read the algorithms in microseconds to see which sentiments appeal to as many people as possible, and whether these people can be mobilized, internet users can be mobilized through the practices of anonymous armies, anonymous or voluntary armies, relawan, and this is the game that the elites are playing. So it's less about the divisions about conservative and moderate ideas within the Ummah, but it's about the political language in which some parts of conservative values and some parts of modern values can be made more sumir. What's that? Sumir in English? Obscure. Yeah, obscure and subsumed under that elite competition.
Can I add 30 seconds to this? Just 30 seconds quickly. So a lot of this hard language that Nancy was talking about appeals to young, disenfranchised people and so on, right? So the Muhammadiyah youth, the Nahdlatul Ulama youth, they're all very aware of this, that the language, the hardline language appeals to young people. But on the other hand, they also depend on state patronage throughout their history, right? So this is a problem for them. On the one hand, they don't want to be left behind by the youths who are going to the hardline organizations, but they want to keep state patronage. And that is the problem that they're dealing with at the moment.
Hey, Inaya, I'm going to jump to Sam's question because it relates to something that you've just brought up. Sam would like to hear more about the role of the internet and social media in taming the more politically threatening elements of populism. He notes that in other settings, people argue that the internet has fostered radicalization, but it sounds here like the internet may be a force for moderation or at least co-optation by mainstream actors and organizations.
It's useful to look at the internet's architecture as a jalanan, a road. There's the highway, there's the main road, and there's these small alleyways that only certain particular people know of, usually people within that locality. And there's these vigilantes, premans waiting in these alleyways to ask for money when people want to go through their territory. The internet's architecture is similar to this map. And radicalization occurs within small platforms, which Densus 88 or the police find it difficult, or they need to do ethnography to really know, ethnography or intel work to actually know who's speaking in which platform with whom, and who's the admin, and when do they do an offline meeting, etc. So radicalization processes are still present, and alive. And when we're talking about Islamic populism, we're talking about the larger ummah, or people who feel marginalized and is mobilized against certain factions of the elite or in support of certain factions of the elite. So we're talking about the main road and the highway. We're talking about the roads where we can see. And there should be more legal structures, but these legal structures and rules are being hijacked. Campaigners and actors and cyber armies, more sentiment that political language that people ummah ascribes to. So in a way, it does undermine democracy, because rather than using the main area or the main social media discussion space to deliberate, discuss about the policies that the governments or presidential candidates or their parliamentary candidates are promising, and making them accountable for the promises that they made, people are instead talking about who's kafir and who's not, and who's a more pious leader and who's not. And also on another note, some users are speaking of Islamists and the rising piety among Muslim middle class, which are of the same class, are people who have become, who are regressing. They're more educated, but their practices are terbelakang or backwards. So this is the kind of discussions that are present. So it does undermine democracy, because the kind of deliberation and accountability that proponents of those who supporting the democratic agenda is not happening.
Nancy, did you have something to add there?
No, I wanted to ask for clarification on who are the factions you were mentioning about that we're talking about these groups being terbelakang. So you gave an example earlier.
Oh, she's frozen.
She's frozen.
We might have to leave that till Inaya rejoins us. But in the meantime, Betty, I have a question for you from Yeni. Her question is related to the opinion of some Indonesia experts that consider that how Islamists are being currently targeted by the incumbent government, and that their influence is exaggerated and overinflated to create a negative sentiment towards the Islamists. Do you agree with such a remark, or do you think that Islamic populism is real and potentially detrimental to Indonesian democracy? And do you think the government's actions are justifiable or undemocratic?
I think that there is a danger of both overestimating and underestimating Islamic populism, which can be, manifest in different ways, right? Now, I think that the reality is that you do not have a coherent Islamic populist movement in Indonesia. And in my book, I explain several reasons why that is the case. There is no immediate possibility of an Islamic populist-led takeover of the state. Yet, without achieving that level of influence, without really achieving, ideological hegemony, in the Gramscian sense, the ideas that percolate through, Islamic populist circles and get mainstream through the media, social media, through the sphere of consumption and so on, get adopted by other social and political forces. So what is happening really is the representatives and the various representatives of Islamic populism in Indonesia are really becoming co-opted as junior partners, when the major forces are fighting against each other, right? So there is no danger, if you call it danger, right, of them taking over the state, but their ideas are going to percolate through and pervade through political discourse, whether or not they're in power or not. That is, I think, the situation that we're facing now, and that which we've called the mainstreaming of these ideas.
Just before we return to Nancy's question, there's another related question we've had from an anonymous participant that relates to what Betty's just been talking about. Have you explained the recent crackdown on FPI and its links with the oligarchy patrons? Will it affect how Indonesian Muslims present themselves as pious or religious, considering the possible backlash from the government? That's the question.
Well, we all know that the Jokowi government is sensitive to attacks that it is not Muslim enough, that it is communist, that it is actually pro-Chinese, etc., and of course, the rhetoric of the FPI and many of these organizations, disconcerts the government in that sort of way. But remember, it has also, embraced other Islamic forces. And although these Islamic forces are being presented as the force of moderation in Indonesia, remember that because of that dilemma that I mentioned earlier, they're actually mainstreaming a lot of these ideas that are coming from outside of them as well. Otherwise, they will be left by a ummah, large sections of which are angry, and feel that disconnected to the political process and so on. So that, I think, is important to understand. Now, the second thing is that we've just went through elections and so on, so it's just settled, this round. Now, how the FPI and all these other organizations, some of which, have permeated into other entities and so on, because it really doesn't matter, what they call themselves, will probably be recruited in mobilised in the next round, of fighting between the elites anyway, and they will be, I think, guaranteed to be somebody's junior partner.
Inaya, if we can return to Nancy's question for clarification on which factions were using the terms like terbelakang.
There are two main narratives during the presidential elections, those supporting Prabowo and those supporting Jokowi. My colleague and I, Muninggar Saraswati, we did data mining on the sentiments and languages used on social media to support or to go against these certain candidates. And it appears that Jokowi's alignment, Jokowi itu komunis and Prabowo Islam radical. And in the comment section of the vast array of people who contributed to those sentiments, to those ideas, are those saying that orang-orang Islam kenapa sih semakin terbelakang? Why are Muslims are becoming more going backwards in the way they see who should be our country's leaders? Backwards can refer to, because this is a language in which, because it's abstract, it has that space of being multiple. It has that space for multiple interpretation, which is useful to be mobilized even further, to be brought into a different kind of discussion or repressed so that it doesn't be discussed anymore, because nothing explicit is actually being said that can be proven. And this backwardness or regression can refer to returning back to the old order, new order, in which Prabowo is seen as part of the Suharto clan, and also can be seen as Islamic values being in tension with the kind of national, hyper-nationalist ideals, Jokowi supporters, which is also heterogeneous and different sections of the middle class, lower, middle, and upper class participate in the discussion. So it needs to be nuanced enough for campaigners or armies to mobilize. But these are the two directions of the discussion.
Okay, Joel has a question for all three of you. He'd like to know how are populist Muslim preachers in Indonesia held to account? Compared to Agim, who had a dramatic downfall, how have Siao and Fila handled these challenges?
Nancy probably could have a go at that. Right?
I can say something and then hopefully you can jump in, but I think what we've been talking about in part is how the use of these various forms of media allow people to circumvent various attempts to tamp them down. So different than, even appearing on TV, live TV, or, giving speeches. If that's not safe or if that's not acceptable, you can go online, or most of them have their own publishing houses as a way to get around any sort of censorship. So, Siao did face considerable backlash at particular times. His speeches were canceled and, he just seemed to come back after that. Fila, I know a little bit less about in terms of pushback to his writings. So maybe Vedi or Inaya want to weigh in.
I suppose I'd just like to make a general point before Inaya jumps in, and that is if you get rid of Felix Xiao and the likes of him, right, others will arise. Why?
Yes.
Because they are fulfilling a need. They're fulfilling, a desire for somebody to speak on behalf of us impoverished, marginalized, disenfranchised Ummah, right? Somebody's going to take up that mantle because, you can make a lot of mileage out of it, right? So, and the other thing is this, Nancy, I think, mentioned about, how, middle-class youth and so on are often attracted to these ideas. And that's true. But one of the things I often say is, look, if you look at the statistics about the Indonesian middle class, and some people say it's 50% of the 45%, 55%, 63% of the population. But I did a study of this years ago. A sort of amateurish statistical study, but economists have actually then affirmed that finding, that something like 70% of that 50 whatever percent are just at the margins of the definition of the middle class. And therefore they are in actuality precariously middle class. And therefore they have the education, the skills, the aspirations, consumption habits, and so on of the middle class, but not without the economic underpinnings. And they are angry, and they need people to voice their grievances and so on.
Inaya, have you got something to add, or shall we move on?
No, I think Fedi answered that very well. Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Jeremy, who says there's a debate in the populism literature between those who see its emergence as a function of institutional dysfunction and those who view it as a product of cultural forces, perceived threats due to democratic change in economic inequality, authoritarian personalities, and so on. So very much linked to what Vedi has just mentioned. Where do you stand on this debate, Vedi and Inaya?
Well, if I may, because this is, things that I've actually sort of dealt with it in my writing more directly, is I recognize actually the validity of the different understandings of populism, right? The more institutional ones, the ones that look at it as social movements, the one that looks at it as performative and so on. I don't actually sort of dismiss any of this. But what I do try to do is in my previous work to put a more material basis to these sorts of different strands, you know, of understandings of populism. So, for example, you know, in the Latin American literature, Laclau, you know, the discursive analysis of Laclau is very important, right? But actually, if you go back to Laclau in the 70s, you know, the material basis of the discourse is much more pervasive in the way that he explains it, right? And I actually go back to that, to early Laclau, I think. And by doing that, I think I can, you know, talk about populism as a dysfunction of institutions, populism as, you know, as a cultural reaction, populism as thin ideology and so on, but connecting it to politico-economic macro structures that manifest themselves in specific ways, you know, in specific contexts, and therefore also are expressed in different ways, which now brings me to the work that I'm doing today.
And Inaya, I'm sure people would be interested in your perspective too on this question.
Yeah, I want to flesh out what Fedi mentioned as material basis, because his work has been criticized as being overly deterministic. But if you look at the material basis within neoliberal structures, they mutate with times. So you can see a material basis interacting with users through algorithms that commodify expressions, and it goes into capital. And you see this capital as being part of venture investments from countries like the US and China. And this kind of investment is also part of the kind of anti-Chinese sentiment that appeals to the parts of the Ummah that supports Prabowo, because he's seen as a figure, an authoritative figure that can maintain national sovereignty. And you can see this discussion as well in the recent forming of the National Agency for Research and Innovation and the algorithm Hill Bukit Algoritma, in which it's seen as data sovereignty. So when we look at a material basis, when we see capital, we need to understand it within the neoliberal times we live in. So it's very flexible, very fluctuative. It's precarious. It manifests in the precarious labor market, in which much of the middle class are borderline and much of the upper class are borderline middle class. And when there is a humiliation, when someone goes downward in their social mobility, those religious values, those verses in the Quran saying "Rezeki nggak kemana" would be useful in pacifying that kind of aggravation, and aligns them with certain Islamic clerics that can fulfill that, can tame that aggravation. So that's adding up and fleshing out Fedi.
I'd like to sneak in our final question in our remaining minutes. It's also related to the material basis from Tanvir, who asks, can you elaborate on the relationship between the Islamic populist movement in Indonesia and the rise of Islamic banking and finance in the past 2 decades? There's a sense that the movement is co-opting Islamic banking towards broader political goals, or is it the arrival of Islamic banking and finance an end in itself to achieve financial inclusion, socioeconomic justice and development?
I could have a go at this if nobody wants to.
Can I take this?
Oh, you want to take this?
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, is it me or okay? Is it me? All
We'll
right.
start with Inaya. We'll start with Inaya, and then if we've got time, Betty, you can have a go.
Start with me.
Yeah.
Okay, the whole banking structure is part of financial capitalism. So when we understand the constitution of power as something being centralized, and understand that there is an equality of capital, inequality of establishment of infrastructure and the infrastructure of finance, then we look at the kind of alternative economic practices like the small business enterprises, or kaki lima, or social entrepreneurship, as like these small outliers within a larger system that's exploitative. And when these small outliers and alternatives, which are interesting to me because they social practices and economic practices are one, which is whereas in these large finance structures, it's transactional. And in these outliers, when it becomes part of Islamic banking, it becomes a part of appealing to a larger Muslim section, Muslim middle class, a section that wants to Islamicize their banking practices. And this way it's mainstreamed into larger financial capitalism. So that's what I wanted to add. Fedi?
Yeah, actually, I was going to say almost exactly the same thing, except maybe I could add that I once went to an international Sharia banking conference in Morocco, and you had people from the Emirates, all over the Muslim world, talking about Sharia banking and how it would fulfill the needs of the Ummah and so on. But frankly, I was not terribly impressed. And I came out of it thinking that really, as Inaya was basically saying, Islamic banking is just another way that international finance capital has found a new market and a new product that it can cater to a particular kind of population that has some money, has aspirations, but wants to maintain some sort of religious identity. But in actual fact, it does not constitute any kind of direct threat to the international financial system whatsoever. It's completely integrated within it.
Okay, thanks for that, Vidi. Apologies to those of you who posted questions we haven't had time for. It's great to have the level of engagement. But we need to wrap up now, and I'm sure you'll agree that this has been a great way to start our IS4 adventure. We had almost 400 registrations for this seminar, so we're off to a great start. But please do spread the word and encourage your friends and colleagues to join us for our next talk on the 27th of May, when Dina Prapto Raharja will talk about non-government accountability initiatives in Indonesia's national health insurance. Diego Fossati is the discussant. And just be aware, we are rotating the time zones so that everyone around the world gets a bite of this cherry. Indonesians are always catered for, but the rest of us get 2 out of 3. So please do check the website for the timing of that seminar, but it's on the 27th of May, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much, and looking forward to meeting you again for future sessions.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.